Thanks, Maxime. Brilliant. And yeah, as I said, probably one of our most exciting young professionals. And going back to what David said earlier, yeah, I think this is the future. And it's not just Ukraine, this is globally. Yeah, we need to invest in our youth. Okay. And Maxime is the vice chair of our young professionals group, along with his colleague Peter from Caritas. So it's great, great news. I will invite Maxime back up after the panel discussion, because we want to open the floor up to you. So anything you've heard during the evening, if there's any questions you've got that you want to pose to the panelists and some of the speakers, that would be fantastic. And you'll get the opportunity to do that. Just a couple of admin points as well. I've just been asked to remind everybody to use the QR codes, yeah, to pay for your drinks. I'm not paying for them. So, all right. So basically, I think what we're going to do now is we're going to move to now our keynote speaker, I guess, is an old friend of mine, actually. And I'm going to introduce Marcus Olroyd, who's going to come online now, hopefully. So Marcus is the founder and director of Bureau Consultancy. He specializes in leadership, strategic communication, behavioral analysis, and decision-making under pressure. He's a former British Army commando, a detective inspector with over 30 years experience in high-risk environments. He has led complex criminal investigations, negotiated with hostage takers, supported people in suicidal crisis, and advised on critical incidents where effective leadership was essential. Today, he works internationally with organizations across the public and private sector, helping leaders strengthen resilience, improve communication, and make better decisions in uncertain environments. I think this is the key about strategic risk management, the ability to make these decisions. So I'm going to hand over now to Marcus. And again, at the end, Marcus will come back on screen and you'll have to answer any questions you have. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Ian. Just checking that you can, one, see my screen, and two, that you can hear me loud and clear. Yeah, I've got a thumbs up online. What about the audience where you're at, Ian? Just got silence at the moment. What's the thumbs up? Does that mean the audience in Ukraine can hear?
Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
We got you loud and clear now.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian, and thanks to the previous speakers, extremely insightful. But I just want to clear one thing up before we do go any further. Ian's comment about he's not buying the drinks. Whilst we were old friends many years ago, he never bought the drinks then either. So it's good to see that nothing's changed there. I often start my talks by disappointing the audience, because when it comes to strategic risk management and leadership, there is no silver bullet, and I'm sure that's kind of stating the obvious. But if there was, then I wouldn't be one of the first to download the program, install the software, and run by it. But as we have already come to understand, is that risk is ever changing, and I think that the biggest risk to organizations is potentially not the risk itself, but it's how leaders think, how leaders communicate, and how leaders make decisions under pressure whilst considering their appetite to risk. So I think that's something that we need to harness when we look at the younger population coming through out there in the Ukraine. I'm not going to speak about geopolitical risks. I'm not going to talk about cyber threats, and I'm not going to speak about security frameworks, albeit I know a little bit about some of those, but I'm certainly not an expert in all of those. Instead, what I'd like to talk about is something that sits underneath every one of those, and that's about people, and that's about the human factor. So just building on a little bit of what Ian mentioned in my introduction, throughout my career, I've had the privilege of serving with the British military. I spent 25 years as a detective inspector, investigating serious and complex crime here in the UK. I've advised on major investigations. One of my specialist roles was crisis and a hostage negotiator for the best part of a decade, um, whereby you would negotiate with hostage takers and also people in suicide, people who have got tendencies for wanting to take their own lives. And more recently, working with organisations and senior leaders and their teams around the world. Um, Now, whilst those environments look quite different, so if we look at those, they'll probably have a different mission statement, they'll probably have different set of values, different people, um, different objectives even. Um, there's one thing that kind of runs through all of those areas. And that is what I've noticed is that the greatest risk rarely comes from the situation itself. It comes from what pressure does to people. And that's one thing that I am currently studying in my research project within my master's degree around human behavior and emotion. A fascinating subject. Pressure, it changes how we think, and I'm sure you can all relate to that. Even when you think you're going to be late for a meeting or you've got multiple demands placed on you, we've got a fine amount of resources that we can deploy and dispatch to our physical, our emotional, and our cognitive abilities. So, I say pressure changes how we communicate, it changes how we make decisions, and pressure changes how we lead. If we want to become better, or if we want to become better at managing risk, I think it's already been touched on by a couple of, by Maxine and Dr. David Rumans that we need to become better at understanding ourselves, and that bleeds into supporting the youth of Ukraine. And that's because every risk ultimately lands on someone's desk. Someone has to make a decision, somebody has to communicate, someone essentially has to lead. That's why I'd like to talk about three core themes really over the next 10 minutes or so. They're not theories, they're just my perspective that I've come to accept and come to shine a light on, touch points that I always go back to that I think are important when we're looking at managing and leading under pressure. If we look at the first lesson, that's about leadership creates clarity. And one of the greatest misconceptions, and again, this is my view, one of the greatest misconceptions in leadership is that people expect certainty. Well, whilst that's a nice to have, we can't always have that certainty. Actually, what I think people do want in today's world is clarity, and it's the lack of confusion. So as leaders, we often feel under pressure, and I've been there myself, managing multiple teams across multiple areas, and all wanting something quite different from you because the pressures that are placed on those individuals are very different as well. The reality is that we don't have all the answers. We rarely do. And when I look at when I worked as a crisis and hostage negotiator or a detective inspector managing complex and serious crime, I never had complete information. We don't. It's impossible. We don't have a crystal ball that we can look into the future. But what we do have is people. And when we look at incidents minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, they evolve. The situation changes, people change, new information comes to light, and therefore our decision making changes. But also with that brings new elements of pressure. So our role as leaders is not to pretend that we know everything. And I think the better leaders that I've worked with over the years are those that have the humility and the integrity to say that they don't know everything. But this is about creating clarity despite uncertainty. So let's say this is what we know, and this is what we don't know. And this is what we're doing next. This is the roadmap. This is a journey that we're going along, accepting that that might change. And that creates confidence. It brings buy-in. It gets buy-in by your teams and your individuals. And that's not because we're talking about certainty. We're talking about people understanding the direction. As today's organisations operate in a permanently uncertain world, as Dr. David Rubens touched on, VUCA, volatile and uncertainty, ever changing. And everybody wants a piece of us every minute. When we look at the amount of platforms on our mobile phones and laptops, you can easily count up 20, 25 different touch points of how people can get in contact with you and want something from you. That creates pressure. So how do you manage that? And as I say, technology changes. God knows what that's going to look like in another 5, 10 years or so. As we already heard, political environments change, markets change, conflicts change, the environment changes. And again, I'm just going to cite Dr. David Rubin talking about you can't just look at what's happening to the world in isolation in different areas. The rise in sea levels, food security, for example, the increase in heat, the emissions, they all come hand in hand. So leaders who wait for certainty, just to finish this section off, before making decisions usually wait too long. The leaders who thrive are those who create clarity while uncertainty still exists. For me, that's leadership. The second thing I want to talk about is communication, and that's a real passion of mine, is the communication in leadership and throughout our teams. So how does communication, risk management, how does that show up? Well, throughout my military and policing career, I learned something that completely changed how I think about communication. Information rarely arrives dramatically, notwithstanding at times it can do, but more so it whispers. It vibrates in between the margins, places we can't see. So, for example, a junior member of staff notices something unusual, let's say. Something sees something subtle, a change in behavior, that nuance, the cues that are available. Someone feels uncomfortable. Do we notice? Someone spots a pattern. The question isn't, did someone notice? The question is, did they feel safe enough to speak? We're talking about psychological safety and well-being, making people feel heard, creating a platform, a culture, an environment within your team, your division, your company or organization where people feel confident that they can speak up. So many organizations, as we know, they'll spend massive amounts of money on cultures and building systems to detect risk. And whilst that's great, they might unintentionally build cultures where people are afraid to actually challenge senior leaders, and I've experienced that myself. That's not a technological problem. That's a people problem. More so, it's a leadership problem. So what would look like to say is that when psychological safety exists, people speak early, and when it doesn't exist, people stay silent until the problem becomes impossible to ignore, and it just amplifies and exacerbates the issue. So just to finish off on that small lesson is that one conversation held today always is almost easier than 50 conversations or 100 conversations later down the track when you're dealing with a crisis. So risk management is not simply about collecting information, it's about creating cultures where information flows freely. They're the best cultures I've operated in. And one of the most valuable skills I've learned, particularly in hostage negotiation, it wasn't about the talking, it was about listening, really listening, understanding the individual, what sits behind the message, listening beyond the words. Emotionally, how are they feeling? What are they really wanting to say? Looking for the hesitation, listening to the pauses. What is that saying? Essentially, listening for what isn't being said. And those same skills, they apply every single day inside organizations, and that's what I see when I work with senior leadership teams and their people. So the quality of our listening often determines the quality of our decisions. So moving on, the last caveat I want to talk about is that pressure changes thinking. And as I mentioned earlier in this talk, is that we've got a finite amount of resources available. And when pressure comes from all angles, we have to look at where we're going to deploy those resources and manage pressure across the others. We speed up, we become faster, we could become more alert. And whilst that's good in some senses, if we get overload, it can be a bit of a problem. We become more certain, we become more reactive, we rely more on our biases, we seek information that confirms what we already believe. And for all those psychologists on the call, or for anybody who's read anything about cognitive biases, we call this confirmation bias. It just confirms our thinking. A curiosity disappears. That's dangerous. That's dangerous. Whilst bias can help us and protect us, we've got to be very mindful that it might not be correct. Strategic risk management depends on curiosity, and that's the thread of this talk. The best leaders I've worked with have a habit. They deliberately slow themselves down, and they ask more insightful, better, formatted and posed questions. What are we missing? Who disagrees? What assumptions are we making? What's the hypotheses? What evidence changed our minds? What changed your mind? Now, those questions are quite simple, but they project organizations, for me, from one of the greatest risks of all, and that's about collective overconfidence. When we're all saying the same thing and relying on our biases and assumptions, that is a very risky area to be in. So just finishing off, really, what does, for me, AI and leadership, how does that relationship pan out? Well, artificial intelligence will certainly transform our profession. It has done already, and it's moving at a rapid rate of knots. Pretty frightening. And how that affects warfare is even more so frightening. There's no doubt about that. Yes, it will process information faster than the human brain can possibly do. It might identify trends sooner, model scenarios more accurately. Don't think we can argue with that. Predict patterns that we may never see ourselves. It might lift the mask and the veil off certain situations. But my personal belief is it doesn't replace leadership. AI doesn't replace leadership. What it does do, however, it enhances it. When we look at algorithms, they don't build trust. Algorithms don't create psychological safety, as I've mentioned. They don't inspire courage, and algorithms don't negotiate relationships, albeit there might be some models that can help you along the way. But people do. Your leaders do. The future of strategic risk management is not human versus AI, it's human judgment supported by AI. And hopefully we're already seeing that play out. Yes, technology will continue to improve. The human element becomes even more valuable. So I just want to leave you with this really. Kind of four things. That leadership creates clarity. Good leadership creates clarity. Communication reveals risk. Good communication. That means listening well, asking insightful, mindful, curious questions. That curiosity projects judgment, and trust enables resilience. So I'd like to finish just with, I guess, one final thought. So we're kind of on the hour. I'm mindful I've run over, Ian, but every organization represented in the room today, every division, every department, and every individual, you're likely to have different objectives. You might have different budgets, different structures, cultures even, different risks. But every one of us depends upon people making good decisions under pressure. How do you protect those people? How can you alleviate the pressure? That is why I believe the future of strategic risk management isn't simply about becoming better at predicting uncertainty. Uncertainty will always exist. So the future, for me, belongs to leaders who create trust when certainty is impossible, who communicate with honesty, integrity when information is incomplete, and who remain curious when everyone else becomes convinced that they are right. The leaders who understand that every strategic risk is ultimately managed through people. So I just want to leave you with a quote that has stayed with me for a few years now. Pressure doesn't build character, it reveals it. Perhaps the same can be said of organizations. Pressure doesn't create resilient organization, it reveals whether resilience already exists. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed my 10-15 minute talk, and I may have to jump off the call a little bit earlier, Ian. So I don't know how long I will be about, but you can reach out to me. I've got my details on. I don't know how clear the screen is at your end. Or you can contact me through LinkedIn, email, my website, however you wish. So thank you.